So, welcome to the Leake Street Tunnel. Now, I know this place looks rather arty and farty, kind of like Brooklyn over in New York or some of the graffiti areas that you'd find over in Melbourne, but we have to remember that we're here in England, which means we have something called history. In fact, the history of this place goes all the way back to when most of our parents are dating back in 1800. Now, back in 1800, there are around 500,000 people living in what we call Greater London. But if we then fast forward to 1851, there are now 2.5 million people living in London. The reason being is because we go through our Industrial Revolution and people move away from the countrysides and to the cities. And in fact, people move to London at a rate of 500 people a day. Now, this tends to cause a little bit of a problem, and our population swelled massively up to 2.5 million. Now, as I said, it causes some problems. The two problems being that we had weird rules surrounding burials. Number one, you could never be cremated, because burning yourself means that you would go to the devil. Kind of makes sense if you're religious. Number two, wherever you lived, you subsequently had to be buried within 1 mile of wherever that was, because that was your local parish and your spirit must live on there. Now, you found by 1850, absolutely every single one of the graveyards here in central London was completely full. Nasty circumstances, people are being buried 15 people deep. And in worse circumstances, unimportant people like me were pulled out so that more important and beautiful people could be laid to rest. Now, clearly this couldn't continue because families like mine were starting to get jolly fed up that they could no longer rest in peace. More pieces. Ugh. Anyway, what happened? Well, in 1850, the government decided to do something about the 1 mile law, and you could now be buried wherever you wanted. The government, in fact, built Highgate Cemetery in North London and Brompton over in West, and these are still beautiful church graveyards still today. I know it sounds weird, but they are genuinely a great place for a morning walk, and that is the worst pun you'll hear on tour. Now, what happens is one man sees the success of these two graveyards and he decides to build his own cemetery down in Brookwood in Surrey. The only issue with that is 30 miles from where I'm currently stood. So what he has to do is create a way of people getting down to his cemetery. So what he does is he builds this brickwork arch that we are currently stood underneath, lays a couple of train tracks and puts a train on top for good measure, and he calls it the Necropolis Railway, meaning the railway of the dead. Now, all the Necropolis Railway does, it takes the dead bodies and their families from here in Waterloo and would ship them down to the cemetery in Surrey, bringing the living relatives back in the afternoon. Now, this being Victorian Britain, we divided everybody up because, as we know from America and California, that always ends well. So we had the Anglican service for the British Christians, and then we had the non-Anglican service for quite literally everybody else. And of course, there was a first, a second, and a third-class system on both trains, because God forbid a first-class body like mine mingle with a third-class pauper. Highly uncouth. Now, the service runs from 1851 all the way up until 1942, and is when we were at war with Germany. Now, if you cast your eyes all the way down to the bottom of the tunnel, you'll note that there is a bridge. Now, this is where a V1 bomb landed during World War II, and it destroyed the entire Necropolis railway station. Now, because it's 1942, the car has widely been accepted. In fact, the Mini came along just 17 years later, so we saw no point in reopening the service. So we didn't. So from 1942 all the way up until 1994, this place does absolutely nothing. Nada, zilch, nil, point. But then, in 1994, we had the Eurostar being built right here above our heads here in Waterloo, and this simplified the opening of the Eurostar, where you could catch the train from here to Waterloo all the way down to Paris and go and spend the afternoon with Jean-Pierre and his beautiful wife. But for boring and complicated reasons, in 2007 we decided to move it from here in Waterloo up to King's Cross St Pancras, so once again this tunnel lay vacant. But in 2007, a young aspiring graffiti artist known as Banksy decided to come down here and host what he called the Festival of Cans, essentially inviting all of his graffiti buddies to come down here and to spray paint the living daylights out of the tunnel. Now, normally a local council would absolutely hate this. However, Southwark, in this example, had a look down the tunnel and they thought, well, actually, the work in here is jolly delightful. So they thought, why don't we let these rapscallions have a little area where they can enhance their skills? Yes, very good. Now, what happened is they decided to make it London's first, and still to this day, only legal graffiti site. Work in here lasts anywhere from 1 day to 1 week on average, and work is constantly turning over. Now, before anyone asks, no, there are no Banksys left. Everyone took great pride in covering up a Banksy, and also, he's not actually that liked in the wider graffiti community, mainly because he calls himself an anti-capitalist, but also because, well, he cheats. He uses stencils. The other main artist in here was a man called King Robbo, who was much more of a traditional graffiti artist, doing everything by freehand. The reason we don't know of King Robbo is supposedly in 2009 he was stood up of a ladder spray painting. He fell off of the ladder and he broke his neck. Rumour has it that it was Banksy holding the ladder, kicked it out from underneath him, and he went on to be the world's most famous graffiti artist. So what I'm going to invite you guys to do now is to have a little wander through the tunnel. Advice, keep your eyes up and on the roof, because that is where the best work is. And remember to take lots of photos, which if you don't put a photo up on Facebook, it never happened. Fact. Done.